So, my Ford Maddox Ford. Parade's End. A note on the author. Ford Maddox Ford, born Ford Herman Hoifer in 1873, in Surrey, published over 80 books during his writing career. His novels include The Inheritors, Romance, The Fifth Queen, and The Good Soldier, and the autobiographical works Return to Yesterday, It Was the Nightingale, and The March of Literature. In 1915, Ford Maddox Ford enlisted in the army and served as an infantry soldier in the First World War. Parade's End was based on his personal experiences of war. It was published in 4 parts between 1924 and 1928. Ford Maddox Ford died in Deauville, France in 1939. Book 1. Some Do Not. Part 1. The 2 young men, they're of the English public official class, sat in the perfectly appointed railway carriage. The leather straps to the windows were of virgin newness, the mirrors beneath the new luggage racks immaculate as if they had reflected very little. The bulging upholstery in its luxuriant, regulated curves was scarlet and yellow in an intricate, minute dragon pattern, the design of a geometrician in Cologne. The compartment smelt faintly, hygienically, of admirable varnish. The train ran as smoothly. Tidgens remembered varnish, thinking, as British gilt-edged securities. It travelled fast, yet it had swayed or jolted over the rail joints, except at the curve before Tonbridge, or over the point at Ashford where these eccentricities are expected and allowed for. McMaster, Tidgens felt certain, would have written to the company. Perhaps he would even have written to the Times. The class administered the world, not merely the newly created Imperial Department of Statistics under Sir Reginald Ingleby. If they saw policemen misbehave, railway porters lack civility, and insufficiency of street lamps, defects in public services or in foreign countries, they saw to it, either with nonchalant balliol voices or with letters to the Times, asking in regretful indignation, "Has the British this or that come to this?" Or, they wrote, in the serious reviews of which so many still survived, articles taking under their care manners, the arts, diplomacy, inter-imperial trade, or the personal reputations of deceased statesmen and men of letters. McMaster, that is to say, would do all that. Of himself, Tidgens was not so certain. There sat McMaster, smallish, wig, with a trimmed pointed black beard. Such a smallish man might wear to enhance his already germinated distinction black hair of a stubborn fibre, drilled down with a hard metal brush, a sharp nose, strong, level teeth, a white butterfly collar of the smoothness of porcelain, the tie confined by a gold ring, steel blue speckled with black, to match his eyes, as Tidgens knew. Tidgens, on the other hand, could not remember what coloured tie he had on. He had taken a cab from the office to their rooms, and had got himself into a loose, tailored coat and trousers, and a soft shirt, had packed quickly, but still methodically, a great number of things in an immense 2-handled kit bag which you could throw into a guard's van if needed be. He disliked letting that man touch his things. He had disliked letting his wife's maid pack for him. He even disliked letting porters carry his kit bag. He was a Tory, and, as he disliked changing his clothes, there he sat, on the journey, already in large, brown, hugely welted and nailed golf boots, leaning forward on the edge of the cushion, his legs apart, on each knee an immense white hand, and thinking vaguely. McMaster, on the other hand, was leaning back, reading some small unbound printed sheets, rather stiff, frowning a little. Tidgens knew that this was, for McMaster, an impressive moment. He was correcting the proofs of his first book. To this affair, as Tegens knew, there attached themselves many fine shades. If, for instance, you had asked McMaster whether he were a writer, he would have replied with the merest suggestion of a deprecatory shrug. "Oh, dear lady!" For of course no man would ask the question of anyone so obviously a man of the world. And he would continue with a smile. "Nothing so fine. A trifle at odd moments. A critic, perhaps. Yes, a little a critic." Nevertheless, McMaster moved in drawing rooms that, with long curtains, blue china plates, large patterned wallpapers, and large, quiet mirrors, sheltered the long head of the art. And as near as possible to the dear ladies who gave the at-homes, McMaster could keep up the talk, a little magisterially. He liked to be listened to, with respect when he spoke of Botticelli, Rossetti, and those early Italian artists whom he called the primitives. Tegens had seen him there, and he didn't disapprove. For if they weren't, these gatherings, society, they formed the stage on the long and careful road to a career in the first-class government office. And, utterly careless, as Tegens imagined himself of careers or offices, he was, if sardonically, quite sympathetic towards his friend's ambitiousness. It was an odd friendship, but the oddnesses of friendships are a frequent guarantee of their lasting texture. The youngest son of a Yorkshire country gentleman, Tegens himself was entitled to the best that first-class public officers and first-class people could afford. He was without ambition, but these things would come to him as they do in England. So he could afford to be negligent of his attire, of the company he kept, of the opinions he uttered. He had a little private income under his mother's settlement, a little income from the Imperial Department of Statistics. He had married a woman of means, and he was, in the Tory manner, sufficiently a master of flouts and jeers to be listened to when he spoke. He was 26, but very big in a fair, untidy Yorkshire way. He carries more weight than his age warranted. His chief, Sir Reginald Ingleby, when Tegens chose to talk of public tendencies which influence statistics, would listen with attention. Sometimes Sir Reginald would say, "You're a perfect encyclopedia of exact material knowledge, Tegens." And Tegens thought that that was his due, and he would accept the tribute in silence. At a word from Sir Reginald, McMaster, on the other hand, would murmur, "You're very good, Sir Reginald," and Tegens thought that perfectly proper. McMaster was a little the senior in the service, as he was probably a little senior in the age. For as to his roommate's years, or as to his exact origins, there was a certain blank in Tegens' knowledge. McMaster was obviously Scotch by birth, and you accepted him as what was called a son of the manse. No doubt he was really the son of a grocer and Kuparo railway porter in Edinburgh. It does not matter with the Scotch, and he was very properly reticent as to his ancestry. Having accepted him, you didn't, even mentally, make any enquiries. Tegens always had accepted McMaster. At Clifton, at Cambridge, in Chancery Lane, and in the rooms at Gray's Inn. So for McMaster, he had a very deep affection, even a gratitude. And McMaster might be considered as returning these feelings. Certainly, he had always done his best to be of service to Tegens, always at the Treasury and attached as private secretary to Sir Reginald Ingleby, whilst Tegens was still at Cambridge. McMaster brought the notice of Sir Reginald Tegens many great natural gifts, and Sir Reginald, being on the lookout for young men for his ewe lamb, his newly found department, had very readily accepted Tegens as his third in command. On the other hand, it had been Tegens' father who had recommended McMaster to the notice of Sir Thomas Block at the Treasury itself. And indeed, the Tegens family had provided a little money. That was Tegan's mother, really, to get McMaster through Cambridge and install him in town. He had repaid the small sum, paying it partly by finding room in his chambers for Tegan's when in turn he came to town. With the Scots young man, such a position had been perfectly possible. Tegan had been able to go to his fair, ample, saintly mother in her morning room and say, "Look here, mother, a fellow McMaster, you'll need a little money to get through the university." And his mother would answer, "Yes, my dear, how much?" With an English young man of the lower orders, that would have left a sense of class obligation. With McMaster, it just didn't. During Tegan's late trouble, for 4 months before Tegan's wife had left him to go abroad with another man, McMaster had filled a place that no other man could have filled. For the basis of Christopher Tegan's emotional existence was a complete taciturnity, at any rate as to his emotions. As Tegan saw the world, you didn't talk. Perhaps you didn't even think about how you felt. And indeed, his wife's flight had left him almost completely without emotions that he could realize, and he had not spoken more than 20 words at most about the event. Those had been mostly to his father, who, very tall, very largely built, silver-haired and erect, had drifted, as it were, into McMaster's drawing room in Gray's Inn, and after 5 minutes of silence had said, "Will you divorce?" Christopher had answered, "No. No one but a blackguard would ever submit a woman to the ordeal of divorce." Mr. Tegan had suggested that, and after an interval had asked, "You will permit her to divorce you?" He had answered, "If she wishes it, there's the child to be considered." Mr. Tegan said, "You will get her settlement transferred to the child?" Christopher answered, "If it can be done without friction." Mr. Tegan had commented only, "Ah." Some minutes later he had said, "Your mother's very well." Then, "That motor plough didn't answer." And then, "I shall be dining at the club." Christopher said, "May I bring McMaster in, sir? You said you would put him up." Mr. Tegan answered, "Yes, do. Old General Folliot would be there. He'll second him. He's better make his acquaintance." He had gone away. Tegan considered that his relationship with his father was an almost perfect one. They were like two men in the club, the only club, thinking so alike that there was no need to talk. His father had spent a great deal of time abroad before succeeding to the estate. When, over the moors, he went into the industrial town that he owned, he drove always in a coach and four. Tobacco smoke had never been known inside Groby Hall. Mr. Tegan's had 12 pipes filled every morning by his head gardener and placed in rose bushes down the drive. These he smoked during the day. He farmed a good deal of his own land, had sat for Holderness from 1878 to 1881, but had not presented himself for election after the redistribution of seats. He was a patron of 11 livings, rode to hounds every now and then, and shot fairly regularly. He had 3 other sons and 2 daughters, and was now 61. To his sister, Effie, on the day after his wife's elopement, Christopher had said over the telephone, "We'll take Tommy for an indefinite period. Marchant will come with him. She offers to take charge of your 2 youngest as well, so you'll have a maid. You'll save a maid, and I'll pay their board and a bit over." The voice of his sister, from Yorkshire, had answered, "Certainly, Christopher." She was the wife of a vicar near Groby, and had several children. To McMaster, Tegan had said, "Sylvia has left me with that fellow Perrone." McMaster had answered only, "Ah!" Tegan had continued, "I'm letting the house and warehousing the furniture. Tommy is going to my sister Effie. Marchant is going with him." McMaster had said, "Then you'll be wanting your old rooms." McMaster occupied a very large story of the Gray's Inn buildings. After Tegan had left him on his marriage and had continued to enjoy solitude, except that his man had moved down from the attic to the bedroom formerly occupied by Tegan's. Tegan said, "I'll come in tomorrow night, if I may. That will give Ferens time to get back into his attic." That morning, at breakfast, 4 months having passed, Tegan had received a letter from his wife. She asked, without any contrition at all, to be taken back. She was fed up with the Perrone and Brittany. Tegan looked up at McMaster. McMaster was already half out of his chair, looking at him with enlarged, steel-blue eyes, his beard quivering. By the time Tegan spoke, McMaster had his hand on the neck of the cut glass brandy decanter in the brown wood tantalus. Tegan said, "Sylvia asked me to take her back." McMaster said, "Have a little of this." Tegan was about to say, "No," automatically. He changed that to, "Yes, perhaps a liquor glass." He noticed that the lip of the decanter agitated, tinkling on the glass. McMaster must be trembling. McMaster, with his back still turned, said, "Shall you take her back?" Tegan answered, "I imagine so." The brandy warmed his chest in his descent. McMaster said, "Better have another." Tegan answered, "Yes, thanks." McMaster went on with his breakfast and his letters. So did Tegan's. Ferens came in, removed the bacon plate, and set on the table a silver-watered heat dish that contained poached eggs and haddock. A long time afterwards, Tegan said, "Yes, in principle I'm determined, too. But I shall take 3 days to think out the details." He seemed to have no feelings about the matter. Certain insolent phrases in Sylvia's letter hung in his mind. He preferred a letter like that. The brandy made no difference to his mentality, but it seemed to keep him from shivering. McMaster said, "Suppose we go down to Rye by the 11:40. We could get around after tea now the days are long. I want to call on a parson near there. He has helped me with my book." Tegan said, "Did your poet know parsons?" But of course he did. Duchemin is the name, isn't it? McMaster said, "We could call about 2:30. That'll be all right in the country. We stay till 4 with the cab outside. We can be on the first tee at 5. If we like the course, we'll stay next day. Then Tuesday at Hythe and Wednesday at Sandwich. Or we could stay at Rye all your 3 days." "It will probably suit me better to keep moving," Tegan said. "There are those British Columbia figures of yours. If we took a cab now, I could finish them for you in an hour and 12 minutes. Then British North America can go to the printers. It's only 8:30 now." McMaster said with some concern, "Oh, but you couldn't. I could make our going all right with Sir Reginald." Tegan said, "Oh, yes, I can. Ingleby will be pleased if you tell them they're finished. I'll have them ready for you to give him when he comes at 10. McMaster said, "What an extraordinary fellow you are, Chrissy. Almost a genius." "Oh," Tegan answered, "I was looking at your papers yesterday after you left, and I've got most of the totals in my head. I was thinking about them before I went to sleep. I think you make a mistake in overestimating the pull of Klondike this year on the population. The passes are open, but relatively no one is going through. I'll add a note to that effect." In the cab, he said, "I'm sorry to bother you with my beastly affairs, but how will it affect you and the office?" "The office?" McMaster said. "Not at all. It is supposed that Sylvia is nursing Mrs. Satterthwaite abroad. As for me, I wish—" He closed his small, strong teeth. "I wish you would drag the woman through the mud. By God, I do. Why should she mangle you for the rest of your life? She's done enough." Tegens gazed out over the flap of the cab. That explained the question. Some days before, a young man, a friend of his wife's rather than of his own, had approached him in the club and had said that he hoped Mrs. Satterthwaite, his wife's mother, was better. He said now, "I see. Mrs. Satterthwaite has probably gone abroad to cover up Sylvia's retreat. She's a sensible woman, if a bitch." The hansom ran through a nearly empty street, it being very early for the public official quarters. The hoofs of the horse clattered precipitately. Tegens preferred a hansom, horses being made for gentlefolk. He had known nothing of how his fellows had viewed his affairs. It was breaking up a great, numb inertia to inquire. During the last few months, he had employed himself in tabulating from memory the errors in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, of which a new edition had lately appeared. He had even written an article for a dull monthly on the subject. He had been so caustic as to miss its mark, rather. He despised people who used works of reference. But the point of view had been so unfamiliar that his article had galled no one's withers, except possibly McMaster's. Actually, it had pleased Sir Reginald Ingleby, who had been glad to think that he had under him a young man with a memory so tenacious and so encyclopedic a knowledge. That had been a congenial occupation, like a long drowse. Now he had to make inquiries. He said, "And my breaking up the establishment at 29? How's that viewed? I'm not going to have a house again." "It's considered," McMaster answered, "that Lowndes Street does not agree with Mrs. Satterthwaite. That accounted for her illness. Drains wrong. I may say that Sir Reginald entirely, expressly, approves. He does not think that young married men in government offices should keep up expensive establishments in the SW district." Tegens said, "Damn him." He added, "He's probably right, though." He then said, "Thanks, that's all I want to know. A certain discredit has always attached to cuckolds. Very properly, a man ought to be able to keep his wife." McMaster exclaimed anxiously, "No, no, Chrissy!" Tegens continued, "And a first-class public office is very like a public school. You might very well object to having a man whose wife had bolted among its members. I remember Clifton hated it when the governor decided to admit the first Jew and the first... terminology." McMaster said, "I wish you wouldn't go on." "There was a fellow," Tegens continued, "whose land was next to ours. Conder is his name. His wife was habitually unfaithful to him. She used to retire with some fellow for 3 months out of every year. Conder never moved a finger. But we felt Groby and the neighbourhood were unsafe. It is awkward introducing him, not to mention her, in your drawing room. All sorts of awkwardnesses. Everyone knew the younger children weren't Conders. A fellow married the youngest daughter and took over the hounds, and not a soul called on her. It wasn't rational or just. But that's why society distrusts the cuckold, really. Never knows when it mayn't be driven into something irrational and unjust." "But you aren't," McMaster said with real anguish, "going to let Sylvia behave like that." "I don't know," Pigeon said. How am I to stop it? Mind you, I think Condor was quite right. Such calamities are the will of God. A gentleman accepts them. If the woman won't divorce, he must accept them, and if gets talked about. You seem to have made it all right this time. You, and, I suppose, Mrs. Satterthwaite between you. But you won't always be there. Or I might come across another woman. McMaster said. Ah! And after a moment, what then? Tegan said. God knows. There's that poor little beggar to be considered. Marchant says he's beginning to talk broad Yorkshire already. McMaster said, If it wasn't for that, that would be a solution. Tegan said, Ah! When he paid the cabman in front of a grey cement portal with a gabled arch, reaching up, he said, You've been giving the mare less licorice in her mash. I told you she'd go better. The cabman, with a scarlet, varnished face, a shiny hat, a drab box-cloth coat, and a gardenia in his buttonhole, said, Ah, just you to remember, sir. In the train, from beneath his pile of polished dressing and dispatch cases, Tegens had thrown his immense kit-bag with his own hands into the guard's van. McMaster looked across at his friend. It was, for him, a great day. Across his face were the proof sheets of his first, small, delicate-looking volume. A small page, the type black and still odorous. He had the agreeable smell of the printer's ink in his nostrils. The fresh paper was still a little damp. In his white, rather spatulate, always slightly cold fingers, was the pressure of the small, flat, gold pencil he had purchased especially for these corrections. He had found none to make. He had expected a wallowing of pleasure, almost the only sensuous pleasure he had allowed himself for many months. Keeping up the appearances of an English gentleman on an exiguous income was by no mean task. But to wallow in your own phrases, to be rejoiced by the savour of your own shrewd porkishness, to feel your rhythm balanced and yet sober, that is a pleasure beyond most, and an inexpensive one at that. He had had it from mere articles on the philosophies and domestic lives of such great figures as Carlyle and Mill, or on the expansion of intercolonial trade. This was a book. He relied upon it to consolidate his position. In the office they were mostly bored and not vastly sympathetic. They were sprinkling, too. It was beginning to be a large one, of young men who had obtained their entry by merit or sheer industry. These watched promotions jealousy, discerning nepotic increases of increment and clamouring against themselves at favouritisms. To these he had been able to turn a cold shoulder. His intimacy with Tegens permitted him to be rather on the born side of the institution. His agreeableness, he knew he was agreeable and useful to Sir Reginald Ingleby, protected him in the main from unpleasantness. His articles had given him a certain right to an austerity of demeanour. His book he trusted to let him adopt an almost judicial attitude. He would then be the Mr. McMaster, the critic, the authority. And the first-class departments are not averse to having distinguished men as ornaments to their company. At any rate, the promotion of the distinguished are not objected to. So, McMaster saw, almost physically, Sir Reginald Ingleby perceiving the impressment with which his valued subordinate was treated in the drawing-rooms of Mrs. Leamington, Mrs. Cressy, the Hun, Mrs. de Limoux. Sir Reginald would perceive that, for he was not a reader himself of much less than government publications, he would feel fairly safe in making easy the path of his critically gifted and austere young helper. The son of a very poor shipping clerk in an obscure Scotch harbour town, McMaster had very early decided on the career that he would make. as between the heroes and Mr. Smiles, an author enormously popular in McMaster's boyhood, had the more distinctly intellectual achievements open to the very poor Scot. McMaster had had no difficulty in choosing. A pit lad may rise to be a mine owner, a hard, gifted, unsleeping Scots youth pursuing unobtrusively and unobjectively a course of study and a public usefulness, will certainly achieve distinction, security, and the quiet admiration of those around him. It was the difference between the may and the will that McMaster had had no difficulty in making his choice. He saw himself by now almost certain of a career that should give him at 50 a knighthood, and long before that a competence, a drawing room of his own, and a lady who should contribute to his unobtrusive fame. She moving about in that room amongst the best of the intellects of the day, gracious, devoted, a tribute at once to his discernment and his achievements. Without some disaster, he was sure of himself. Disasters come to men through drink, bankruptcy, and women. Against the first two, he knew himself immune, though his expenses had a tendency to outrun his income, and he was always a little in debt to Tietjens. Tietjens fortunately had means. As to the third, it was not so certain. His life had necessarily been starved of women, and arrived at a stage where the female element might, even with due respect to caution, be considered as a legitimate feature of his life, and to fear a rashness of choice due to that very starvation. The type of woman he needed, he knew to exactitude. Tall, graceful, dark, loose-gowned, passionate yet circumspect, oval-featured, deliberative, gracious to everyone around her. You could almost hear the very rustle of her garments. And yet, he had passages when a sort of blind unreason had attracted him almost to speechlessness towards girls of the most giggling behind-the-counter order, being big-bosomed, scarlet-cheeked. It was only Tietjens who had saved him from the most questionable entanglement. "Hang it," Tietjens would say, "don't get messing round that trollop. All you could do with her would to be set her up in a tobacco shop, and she'd be tearing your beard out inside the quarter. Let alone, you can't afford it." And McMaster would have sentimentalized the plump girl to the tune of Highland's Mary, would for a day damn Tietjens up and down for a coarse brute. But at the moment he thanked God for Tietjens. There he sat, near to 30, without an entanglement, a blemish on his health, or a worry with regard to any woman. With deep affection and concern, he looked across at his brilliant junior, who hadn't saved himself. Tietjens had fallen into the most barefaced snare, into the cruelest snare of the worst woman that could be imagined. And McMaster suddenly realized that he wasn't wallowing, as he had imagined that he would, in the sensuous current of his prose. He had begun spiritedly with the first neat square of the paragraph. Certainly his publishers had done him well by in the matter of print. Whether we consider him as the imaginer of mysterious, sensuous, and exact plastic beauty, as the manipulator of sonorous, rolling, and full-mouthed lines, of words as full of colour as were his canvases, or whether he regard him as the deep philosopher elucidating and drawing his illumination from the arcana of the mystic hardly greater than himself, to Gabriel Charles Dante Rossetti, the subject of his little monograph, must be accorded to the name of one who has profoundly influenced the outward aspects, the human contacts, and all those things that go to make up the life of our higher civilization as we live it today. McMaster realized that he had only got thus far with his prose, and had got thus far without any of the relish that he had expected, and that he had turned to the middle paragraph of page 3 after the end of his exordium. His eyes wandered desultorily along the line. The subject of these pages were born in the western central district of the metropolis in the year... The words conveyed nothing to him at all. He understood that was because he hadn't got over that morning. He looked up from his coffee cup, over the rim, and had taken in the blue-grey sheet of a notepaper on Tegan's fingers, shaking, inscribed in the large, broad-nibbed writing of that detestable harridan. And Tegan's had been staring with the intentness of a maddened horse at his, McMaster's, face. And grey, shapeless, like the nose, like a pallid triangle on a bladder of a lard. That was Tegan's face. He could still feel the blow, physical, in the pit of his stomach. He had thought Tegan's was going mad, that he was mad. It had passed. Tegan had assumed the mask of his indolent, insolent self. At the office, but later, he had delivered an extraordinarily forceful, and quite rude, lecture to Sir Reginald on his reasons for differing from the official figures of the population movements in the Western Territories. Sir Reginald had been much impressed. The figures were wanted for a speech of the colonial minister, or an answer to a question, and Sir Reginald had promised to put Tegan's views before the great man. That was the sort of thing to do a young fellow good, because it got kudos for the office. They had to work on figures provided by the colonial governments, and if they could correct those figures, fellows, by sheer brainwork, that scored. But there sat Tegan's in his grey tweeds, his legs apart, lumpish, clumsy, in his tallowy, intelligent-looking hands drooping inert between his legs, his eyes gazing at a coloured photograph of the porter Boulogne beside the mirror beneath the luggage rack. Blonde, high-coloured, vacant apparently. You couldn't tell what in the world he was thinking of. The mathematical theory of waves, very likely, or slips in someone's article on the Arminianism. For absurd as it seemed, McMaster knew that he knew next to nothing of his friend's feelings. As to them, practically no confidences had passed between them. Just two. On the night before his starting for his wedding in Paris, Tegan's had said to him, "Vinny, old fellow, it's a backdoor way out of it. She's bitched me." And once, rather lately, he had said, "Damn it, I don't even know if the child's my own." This last confidence had shocked McMaster so irremediably. The child had been a 7-month child, rather ailing, and Tegan's clumsy tenderness towards it had been so marked that even without his nightmare, McMaster had been affected by the sight of them together. That confidence had then pained McMaster so frightfully. It was so appalling that McMaster had regarded it almost as an insult. It was the sort of confidence a man didn't make to his equal, but only to solicitors, doctors, or the clergy who were not quite men. Or, at any rate, such confidences are not made between men without appeals for sympathy, and Tegan's had made no appeal for sympathy. He had just added sardonically, "She gives me the benefit of the agreeable doubt, and she's as good as said as much to Marchant." Marchant had been Tegan's own nurse. Suddenly, and as if in a sort of unconscious losing of his head, McMaster remarked, "You can't say the man wasn't a poet." The remark had been, as it were, torn from him, because he had observed, in the strong light of the compartment, that half of Tegan's forelock, and the roundish patch behind it was silvery white. That might have been going on for weeks. You live beside a man and notice his changes very little. Yorkshire men of fresh colour and blondish often go speckled with white very young. Tegens had had a white hair or two at the age of 14, very noticeable in the sunlight when he had taken his cap off to bowl. But McMaster's mind, taking appalled charge, had felt assured that Tegens had gone white with the shock of his wife's letter in 4 hours. That meant that terrible things must be going on with him. His thoughts, at all costs, must be distracted. The mental process in McMaster had been quite subconscious. He would not, advisedly, have introduced the painter-poet as a topic. Tejan said, "I haven't said anything at all that I can remember." The obstinacy of his hard race awakened in McMaster. "Since," he quoted, "when we stand side by side, only hands may meet, better half this weary world lay between us, sweet. Better far though hearts may break, bid farewell for aye, lest thy sad eyes, meeting mine, tempt my soul away." "You can't," he continued, "say that that isn't poetry." "Great poetry." "I can't say," Tegens answered contemptuously. "I don't read poetry except Byron, but it's a filthy picture." McMaster said uncertainly, "I don't know that I know the picture. Is it in Chicago?" "It isn't painted," Tejan said, "but it's there." He continued with sudden fury, "Damn it! What's the sense of all these attempts to justify fornication? England's mad about it. Well, you've got your John Stuart Mills and your George Eliot for the high-class thing. Leave the furniture out, or leave me out. At least I can tell you it revolts me to think of that obese, oily man who never took a bath, in a grease-spotted dressing gown and the underclothes he slept in, standing beside a 5-shilling model in a crimped hair, or some Mrs. W. 3 stars gazing into a mirror that reflects their fatigued selves and gilt sunfish and drop chandeliers and plates sickening with cold bacon fat and gurgling about passion. McMaster had gone chalk white, his short beard bristling. You dare talk like that?" he stuttered. "I dare," Tegens answered. "But I oughtn't to. To you. I admit that. But you oughtn't almost as much to talk about that stuff to me either. It's an insult to my intelligence." "Certainly," McMaster said stiffly. "The moment was not opportune." "I don't understand what you mean," Tegens answered. "The moments can never be opportune. Let's agree that making a career is a dirty business. For me, as for you. But certain augurs grin behind their masks. They never preach to each other." "You're getting esoteric," McMaster said faintly. "I'll underline," Tegens went on. "I quite understand that the favour of Mrs. Cressy and Mrs. de la Mole is essential to you. They have the car of that old Don Ingleby." McMaster said, "Damn." "I quite agree," Tegens continued. "I quite approve. It's the game as it has always been played. It's a tradition, so it's right. It's been sanctioned since the days of the Precious Ridiculous." "You've a way of putting things," McMaster said. "I haven't," Tegens answered. "It's just because I haven't that what I do say sticks out in the minds of fellows like you, who are always fiddling about after their literary expression. But what I do say is this. I stand for monogamy." McMaster uttered a "Phew!" of amazement. Tegens answered with a negligent "Aye!" He continued, "I stand for monogamy and chastity, and for no talking about it. Of course, if a man who's a man wants to have a woman, he has her. And again, no talking about it. He'd no doubt be in the end better, and better off if he didn't. Just that it would probably be better for him if he didn't have the second glass of whiskey and soda. call that monogamy and chastity?" McMaster interjected. "I do," Tegens answered. "And it probably is. At any rate, it's clean. What is loathsome is all your fumbling and placket holes and polysyllabic justification by love. You stand for lachrymose polygamy. That's all right if you can get your club to change its rules." "You're out of my depth," McMaster said, "and being very disagreeable. You appear to be justifying promiscuity. I don't like it." "I'm probably being disagreeable," Tejan said. "Jeremiahs usually are. And there ought to be a 20 years close time for discussions of sham sexual morality. You're Paolo and Francesca and Dante's, well, very properly, to hell, and no bones about it. You don't get Dante justifying them. But your fellow whines about creeping into heaven." "He doesn't!" McMaster exclaimed. Tegens continued with equanimity. "Now your novelist who writes a book to justify his every 10th or 5th seduction of a commonplace young woman in the name of the rights of shop boys. I'll admit," McMaster coincided, "that Briggs is going too far. I told him only last Thursday at Mrs. Lemos's." "I'm not talking of anyone in particular," Tejan said. "I don't read novels. I'm supposing a case. And it's a cleaner case than that of your pre-Raphaelite horrors. No, I don't read novels, but I follow tendencies. And if a fellow chooses to justify his seductions of uninteresting and viewy young females along the lines of freedom and the rights of man, it's relatively respectable. It would be better just to boast about his conquest in a straightforward and exultant way. But you carry joking too far sometimes," McMaster said. "I've warned you about it." "I'm as solemn as an owl," Tegens rejoined. "The lower classes are becoming vocal. Why shouldn't they? They're the only people in this country who are sound in wind and limb. They'll save the country if the country's to be saved." "You call yourself a Tory," McMaster said. "The lower classes," Tegens continued equably. "Such of them as get through the secondary schools want irregular and very transitory unions. During holidays they go together on a personally conducted tours to Switzerland and such places. Wet afternoons they pass their tiled bathrooms, slapping each other hilariously on the backs and splashing white enamel paint about." "You say you don't read novels," McMaster said, "but I recognize the quotation." "I don't read novels," Tegens answered. "I know what's in 'em. There's been nothing worth reading written in England since the 18th century except by a woman. But it's unnatural for your enamel splashers to want to see themselves in bright and variegated literature. Why shouldn't they? It's a healthy human desire, and now that printing and paper are cheap, they can get it satisfied. That's healthy, I tell you. Infinitely healthier than..." He paused. "Then what?" McMaster asked. "I'm thinking," Tejan said. "Thinking how not to be too rude." "You want to be rude," McMaster said bitterly, "to people who lead the contemplative, the circumspect life." "It's precisely that," Tejan said. He quoted, "She walks the lady of my delight, a shepherdess of sheep. She is so circumspect and right, she has her thoughts to keep." McMaster said, "Confound you, Chrissy, you know everything." "Well, yes," Tejan said musingly. "I think I should want to be rude to her. I don't say I should be. Certainly I shouldn't if she were good-looking, or if she were your soul's affinity. You can rely on that." McMaster had a sudden vision of Tejan's large and clumsy form walking beside the lady of his, McMaster's, delight, when ultimately she was found, walking along the top of a cliff amongst tall grass and poppies, and making himself extremely agreeable with talk of Tasso and Cimabue. All the same, McMaster imagined the lady wouldn't like Tegan. Women didn't as a rule. His looks and his silences alarmed them. Or they hated him. Or they liked him very much indeed. And McMaster said conciliatorily, "Yes, I think I could rely on that," he added. "All the same, I don't wonder that—" he had been about to say, "I don't wonder that Sylvia calls you immoral." For Tegan's wife alleged that Tegan's was detestable. He bored her, she said, by his silences. When he did speak, she hated him for the immorality of his views. But he did not finish his sentence. And Tegan's went on. "All the same, when the war comes, it will be these little snobs who will save England, because they've the courage to know what they want and to say so." McMaster said loftily, "You're extraordinarily old-fashioned at times, Chrissy. You ought to know as well as I do that a war is impossible, at any rate with this country in it. Simply because—" He hesitated, and then emboldened himself. "We, the circumspect, yes, the circumspect classes, will pilot the nation through the tight places." "War, my good fellow," Tegan said. The train was slowing down preparatorily to running into Ashford. "Is inevitable. And with this country plump centre in the middle of it. Simply because you, fellows, are such damn hypocrites. There's not a country in the world that trusts us. We're always, as it were, committing adultery, like your fellow, with the name of heaven on our lips." He was jibing again at the subject of McMaster's monograph. "He never," McMaster said in almost a stutter, "he never whined about heaven." "He did," Tegan said. "The beastly poem you quoted ends, 'Better far through hearts may break, since we dare not love, part till we once more they meet in a heaven above.'" And McMaster, who had been dreading that shot, for he never knew how much or how little of any given poem his friend would have had by heart, McMaster collapsed, as it were, into a fussily getting down his dressing cases and clubs from the rack, a task he usually left to a porter. Tegan, who, however much a train might be running into a station he was bound for, sat like a rock until it was ready dead still, and said, "Yes, a war is inevitable. Firstly, there's you fellows who can't be trusted, and then there's the multitude of who mean to have bathrooms in white enamel. Millions of them, all over the world, not merely here. And there aren't enough bathrooms in white enamel in the world to go round. It's like you, polygamists with women. There aren't enough women in the world to go round to satisfy your insatiable appetites. And there aren't enough men in the world to give each other women one. And most women want several. So, you have divorce cases. I suppose you won't say that because you're so circumspect and right that there shall be no more divorce. Well, war is as inevitable as divorce." McMaster had his head out of the carriage window and was calling for a porter. On the platform, a number of women in lovely sable cloaks with purple or red jewel cases with diaphanous silky scarves flying over motor hoods were drifting towards the branched train for Rye under the shepherding of erect, burdened footmen. Two of them nodded to Tegan's. McMaster considered that he was perfectly right to be tidy in his dress. You never knew whom you mightn't meet on a railway journey. This confirmed him against Tegan's, who preferred to look like a navvy. A tall, white-haired, white-moustached, red-cheeked fellow limped after Tegan's, who was getting his immense bag out of the guard's van. He clapped the young man on the shoulder and said, "Hello! How's your mother-in-law? Lady Claude wants to know. She says, come up and pick a bone tonight if you're going to Rye." He had extraordinarily blue, innocent eyes. Tegan said, "Hello, General," and added, "I believe she's much better. Quite restored. This is McMaster. I think I shall be going over to bring my wife back in a day or two. They're both at Lobscheid, a German spa. The general said, Quite right. It isn't good for a young man to be alone. Kiss Sylvie's fingertips for me. She's the real thing, you lucky beggar. He added a little anxiously. Oh, what about a foursome tomorrow? Poor Sandbach is down. He's as crooked as me. We can't do a full round at singles. It's your own fault, Tegan said. You ought to have gone to my bone setter. Settle it with my master, will you? He jumped into the twilight of the guard's van. The general looked at McMaster, a quick, penetrating scrutiny. You're the McMaster, he said. You would be, if you're with Chrissy. A high voice called, General! General! I want a word with you, the general said, about the figures in that article you wrote about Ponderland. Figures are all right, but we shall lose the beastly country if... But we'll talk about that after dinner tonight. You'll come up to Lady Claudine's. McMaster congratulated himself again on his appearance. It was all very well for Tegan to look like a sweep. He was of these people. He, McMaster, wasn't. He had, if anything, to be an authority, and authorities wear gold tie rings and broadcloth. General Lord Edward Campion had a son, a permanent head of the Treasury Department that regulated the increase of salaries and promotions in all the public offices. Tegan's only caught the rise train by running alongside it, pitching his enormous kit bag through the carriage window and swinging on the footboard. The master reflected that if he had done that, half of the station would have been yelling, Stand away there! As it was, Tegan's, a station master, was galloping after him to open the carriage door and grinningly depart. Well caught, sir! For it was a cricketing county. Truly, McMaster quoted to himself, the gods to each ascribe a differing lot. Some enter at the portal, some do not. 2. Mrs. Satterthwaite, with her French maid, her priest, and a disreputable young man, Mr. Bayliss, were at Lopshide, an unknown and little frequented air resort among the pine woods of the Taunus. Mrs. Satterthwaite, an ultra-fashionable and consummately indifferent, she only really lost her temper if it at her table, and under her nose you consumed her famous black Hamburg grapes without taking their skin at all. Father Consett was out to have an uproarious good time during his 3 weeks' holiday from the slums of Liverpool. Mr. Bayliss, thin like a skeleton in tight blue serge, golden-haired and pink, was so nearly dead of tuberculosis, as so dead penniless and of taste so costly that he was ready to keep stone quiet, drink 6 pints of milk a day, and behave himself. On the face of it, he was there to write the letters of Mrs. Satterthwaite, but the lady never let him enter her private rooms for fear of infection. He had to content himself with nursing a growing adoration of Father Consett. This priest, with an enormous mouth, high cheekbones, untidy black hair, a broad face that never looked too clean, and waving hands that always looked too dirty, never kept still for a moment, and had a brogue such as is seldom heard outside old-fashioned English novels of Irish life. He had a perpetual laugh, like the noise made by a steam roundabout. He was, in short, a saint, and Mr. Bayliss knew it, though he didn't know how. Ultimately, and with the financial assistance of Mrs. Satterthwaite, Mr. Bayliss became almoner of the Father Consett, adopted the rule of St. Vincent de Paul, and wrote some very admirable, if decorative, devotional verse. They proved thus a very happy, innocent party. For Mrs. Satterthwaite interested herself, it was the only interest she had, in handsome, thin, and horribly disreputable young men. She would wait for them, or sent her car to wait for them at the Gale's gates. Jail gates. She would bring their usually admirable wardrobes up to date and give them enough money to have a good time. When contrary to all expectations, but it happened more often than not, they turned out well, she was lazily pleased. Sometimes she sent them away to a gay spot with a priest who needed a holiday. Sometimes she had them down to her place in the west of England. So they were a pleasant company, and all very happy. Lopshide contained one empty hotel with large verandas and several square farmhouses, white with grey beams painted in the gables with bouquets of blue and yellow flowers, or with scarlet huntsmen shooting at purple stags. They were like gay cardboard boxes set down in fields of long grass. Then the pine woods commenced and ran, solemn, brown, and geometric, for miles up and down hill. The peasant girls wore black velvet waistcoats, white bodices, innumerable petticoats, and absurd party-coloured headdresses of the shape and size of halfpenny buns. They walked about in rows of 4 to 6 abreast, with a slow step, protruding white stockinged feet and dancing pumps, the headdresses nodding solemnly. Young men in blue blouses, knee breeches, and, on Sundays, in 3-cornered hats, followed behind, singing part songs. The French maid, whom Mrs. Satterthwaite had borrowed from the Duchesse de Carbon Chateau Harot in exchange for her own maid, was at first inclined to find the place maussade, but getting up a tremendous love affair with the fine, tall, blonde young fellow included a gun, a gold-mounted hunting knife as long as his arm, a light grey-green uniform with gilt badges and buttons. She was reconciled to a lot. But the young Förster tried to shoot her, et pour cause, as she said. She was ravished, and Mrs. Satterthwaite lazily amused. They were sitting playing bridge in the large shadowy dining hall of the hotel. Mrs. Satterthwaite, Father Consett, Mr. Bayliss, a young blonde sub-lieutenant of great obsequiousness who was there as a last chance for his right lung in his career, and the bearded cure doctor cut in. Father Consett, breathing heavily and looking frequently at his watch, played very fast, exclaiming, "Hurry up now! It's nearly 12. Hurry up, with ye!" Mr. Bayliss, being dummy, the father exclaimed, "There ain't no trumps I've to make. Give me a whiskey and soda quick, and don't drown it as ye did the last." He played his hand with extreme rapidity, threw down his last 3 cards, exclaimed, "Ach! What renowns and all! I'm to Downs, and I've revoked on the top of it." Swallowed down his whiskey and soda, looked at his watch, and exclaimed, "Done it to the minute! Here, doctor, take my hand and finish the rubber." He was to take the mass next day for the local priest, and mass must be fasting from midnight, and without cards played. Bridge was his only passion. A fortnight every year was what, in his worn-out life, he got out of it. On his holiday, he rose at 10. At 11, it was a 4 for the father. From 2 to 4, they walked in the forest. At 5, it was a 4 for the father. At 9, it was, "Father, aren't you coming to your bridge?" And Father Consett grinned all over his face and said, "It's good ye are to poor old Sogget. It will be paid back to you in heaven." The other 4 played on solemnly. The father sat himself down beside Mrs. Satterthwaite, his chin in the nape of her neck. At excruciating moments he gripped her shoulders, exclaimed, "Play the Queen, woman!" and breathed hard down her back. Mrs. Satterthwaite would play the 2 of diamonds, and the father, throwing himself back, would groan. She said over her shoulder, "I want to talk to you tonight, father." took the last trick of the rubber, collected 17 marks, 50 from the doctor and 8 marks from the Unterleutnant. The doctor exclaimed, "You can't take the immense sum from us and then go off. Now we shall be robbed by Herr Palis at Scotting Throat." She drifted all shadowy black silk across the shadows of the dining hall, dropping her winnings in her black satin vanity bag and attended by the priest. Outside the door, beneath the antlers of a royal stag, in an atmosphere of paraffin lamps and varnished pitch pine, she said, "Come up to my sitting room. The prodigal's returned. Sylvia's here." The father said, "I thought I saw her out of the corner of my eye in the bus after dinner. She'll be going back to her husband. It's a poor world." "She's a wicked devil," Mrs. Satterthwaite said. Consett said, "And it's little I've seen her to hold up to the commendation of my flock," he said, and added, "but maybe I'm made unjust by the shock of it.